Okay, so it's that weird space where it says one window says live and the other. Oh, there we
Yeah,
go.
my window says live.
Perfect. Okay, great. All right, everyone. So this is a special, very special edition for the channel, and I'm very happy to have a doctor of internal medicine with us tonight on the show, on the channel. And really, I appreciate everyone coming out on an off evening, on an off hour like this. We seem to do this more and more, but that's okay because we seem to just get more and more interesting guests as time goes on. And so, without any further ado, I have the doc here. And, Doc, would you like to kind of open up and tell us about yourself, your education, your background, specialty, anything that you're comfortable with sharing?
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for having me on the channel. I am a physician. I went to medical school back before 2000. I went to college, did very well in college. I majored in biochemistry. I actually graduated top of my college class. I went to an Ivy League medical school, did very well there. And I did a residency in internal medicine back in the 90s at a major hospital in this country. As I've explained to SMQA, I wish to remain anonymous. I am boarded in internal medicine. I passed those boards and, in fact, were reboarded, so I'm very knowledgeable about the field. I'm also boarded in hospice and palliative medicine as well. And I'm relatively new to the Mandela Effect community. I know I had a phone call some time ago with SMQ, and he shared some of the phone calls. So, I have an unusual background, but I can talk somewhat about the Mandela Effect, what I know to be true changes. I know that there's a lot of Mandela Effect changes that are mentioned on various different channels, and people have made note of these. And most of the people presenting on the channels are not physicians, though I know that some of the people that produce the content do have contacts within the healthcare. And I know that their contacts in the healthcare usually don't want to identify themselves because it's very difficult to be in a profession where you need to know everything that's going on, and it must be a very strange sensation to find that things have in fact changed. So first thing I brought up with SMQ was the change in the anatomical location of the kidneys. That's one that I am very certain is a true Mandela effect change. The kidneys have in fact moved more superior. That means they moved from closer to the head than the foot. And superior, if you are standing it, to move up is basically to move in a superior motion. And they move more medially, that is closer to the midline of the body. That I know is true. It's very strange because I was helping one of my daughters is in college and had an anatomy exam. So I actually got my old Netter Human Anatomy book out, which is the gold standard. And wow, the pictures have actually changed. So it's somewhat disturbing when you're a physician and you're Mandela affected, if I'm saying that right or not, to see that the anatomical positions in these world-class anatomy drawings have in fact changed. And so it makes you wonder, are you remembering things incorrectly? And I had to think about this for a long time because it's been a while since I took gross human anatomy. During the gross human anatomy, I dissected 3 different cadavers. That's what you call a human corpse that's used in scientific study. And what really brought home to me that the fact that the kidneys have moved is not the actual dissections, but looking at CAT scans. I've looked at hundreds, if not thousands, of abdominal pelvis CAT scans. And the way a CAT scan works is it takes serial pictures, serial x-rays of the human body, like cutting slices through loaves of bread, with one end of the loaf of the bread being your head, the other end of the loaf of the bread being your feet. And you just look at all these slices, and that allows you as a physician to reconstruct what's going on 3-dimensionally. And I know that going from top to bottom, starting at the top of the abdomen with the liver, the bottom of the lungs, and proceeding down to the pelvis, it used to be you had to wait a while for the kidneys to show up on those serial cross sections. Nowadays, if you had a CAT scan, they'd show up right away because the kidneys have moved up much higher and much closer to the midline. And I know that it was different, and that seems very difficult to say that, but I recognize the truth, and the kidneys were anatomically in a different position. Also, as I had, when I first talked with SMQ AI over the telephone, I told them that you used to do kidney biopsies were relatively easy because the kidney was so exposed. Now, actually studying the anatomy, it would be quite a challenge, although doable still, to do what's called a percutaneous or through the skin biopsy. But it wasn't like what it used to be, because I can remember doing a biopsy in the 90s with an ultrasound, and you had full access to the kidney when you're ultrasounding the back. It didn't really matter so much where you put the needle, as long as you didn't stick it into one of either the renal artery or vein. And nowadays, you'd have to actually be very careful where you put that needle. Also, seeing how the kidney is closer to other organs where it didn't used to be is very, very strange, and it doesn't make sense from the standpoint of how abdominal cancers would spread. They never used to be able to spread to the kidneys because the kidneys were never in that close a proximity. Now you would have to worry about that. So a lot of changes as it locates, as it relates to the location of the kidney. This has happened, and I've heard a lot about what causes, or potentially causes the Mandela effect, and I don't really have an opinion. I am glad that the documents are being brought forth from those FOIA requests, and they're being analyzed, and people are thinking, particularly this channel, constructively about what's going on in terms of what's causing this digital reality and causing the past to change. But it is fascinating to see, and I know that the kidney change is real. A lot of the changes people talk about, like the heart being on the left, I'm not really that convinced about, because the heart's always been in the midline of the body for me, slightly pointed to the left, where the left ventricle sits, and I understand that. And the holes in the front of the skull, I believe those were there. I'm pretty certain where the facial nerves exit. I'm not 100% certain, but I'm near 99.9% certain that the kidneys have in fact changed position, which is very, very strange. And I don't have really any physician colleagues to discuss this with, because if you tried to discuss that with anybody who is not affected, they wouldn't get where you're coming from. How is that possible? The anatomy has not changed. And the reality is, I think it has. I've also thought about other issues in medicine which didn't make any sense to me at the time, but now from a Mandela effect make a lot more sense. And one of these is the cause of peptic ulcers, or ulcers in the stomach or the first part of the small bowel, which is the duodenum. We've had ulcers for a long time. We had them in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, so on and so forth. Well, it went from not having anything to do with bacterial infection at all to all suddenly all bacteria most ulcers are caused by the presence of an abdominal bacteria called H. pylori, which you probably have heard of. And I always thought that was kind of weird, that I couldn't believe that doctors missed that back in the 60s and the 70s, because when you have a pathologist, when they look at a surgical removal of a stomach, and many were back in when partial gastrectomies were the only treatment for chronic ulcer disease. That's before the days of H2 blockers such as Tagamet or the proton pump inhibitors such as omeprazole were around. People who had recurrent ulcers had their stomachs taken out. They had what's called a partial or a total or a subtotal gastrectomy. And I couldn't believe that they never saw any evidence of bacterial infection, because when you have an organ removed from surgery, the pathologist looks at it under the microscope. And so I always wondered why all of a sudden H. pylori became an issue for the causing of ulcers when it hadn't been 10 years before. And it's not like it's a new wild infection. And I couldn't believe doctors missed it, but I think that's in fact Mandela effect change, that something changed. Some of the other, I've noticed some other changes from things which were rarely around, which became quite common. Another example would be autism, very unusual diagnosis. Then all suddenly it exploded out of nowhere in the early 2000s, which really isn't clearly explained. I know people want to link it to vaccinations, but the vaccinations have been going on for a while. It just seemed very unclear. And if you talk to, I remember talking to a pediatric autism specialist, and she's like, "Oh, autism's always been this common." And I'm like thinking to myself, "No." And now I'm beginning to think that perhaps that was also a Mandela change. The one that I'm most interested is in the one, and the most controversial of all, which I will just get to, is the opiate issue. As I had discussed with SMQ and AI, I was very open that I went to federal prison and was there for a number of years. And I pled guilty to prescribing an opiate without a clinical indication. And this whole opiate crisis sprang up in 2012. And I wandered around the prison. I went to a very nice federal facility, sort of like a club fed type setup. So I had plenty of time on my hand to kind of walk around. And I wondered why the opiate crisis took off in 2012, because these medications like oxycodone, like OxyContin, which is just an extended form of oxycodone, like Opana, which is a chemical precursor to oxycodone, like morphine, like Dilaudid, like fentanyl, these prescriptions had been around forever. And so all the time that I was incarcerated, I kept banging my head against the wall thinking, why now did this opiate crisis take off? Why didn't it happen in the 80s? Why didn't it happen in the 90s or even the earlier 2000s? And it's true, these medications can be addictive. And there was always a low level issue with some people who couldn't tolerate them, developed addiction, and those people sought treatment. But the majority of people could tolerate opiates relatively well in the setting of chronic pain treatment, which is one of the aspects of my previous practice. And I remember reading articles back in the 90s showing that the long-term addiction rate for opiates for patients being treated with chronic pain was very, very low, under 5%. I remember reading those articles. I remember seeing those put together in a syllabus, and now all that appears to be gone. You can't find those type references anymore. And so the other thing that I noticed starting maybe around 2010, I noticed something really interesting happen with these opiates, which still kind of puzzled me. It used to be when patients would start oxycodone in the early 2000s, let's say pre-2008, they couldn't tolerate it. They had a tremendous amount of nausea and vomiting, and actually it was not a preferred opiate. And a lot of people would have absolutely nothing to do with it. And the thing is that that was always a reason why people didn't want to abuse prescription pills, is that they really weren't, they're hard to keep them down, particularly the one that's gotten the most scrutiny with the medical attention, that being the oxycodone or OxyContin. And people felt really nasty for 5 to 7 days on it. The one thing that I noticed in the last couple of years of my practice is that the side effects of these medications started disappearing. And it was the most bizarre thing in the world. I was thinking, for all these chronic pain patients, and I treated a lot for a great number of years, all of a sudden, towards the end of my time practicing, they no longer had side effects to these meds. And I was thinking, wow, that's really strange at the time, but I didn't have any way to make sense of it. And so I signed a plea deal, went to federal prison. I had a lot of time to think about this. And while I was in federal prison, I was unaware of the Mandela Effect. I had read many books about a great many things, read many hundreds of books while in federal prison, really expanded my knowledge base about everything non-medical. But I had not really had any access to any books related to the Mandela Effect. And it's only after coming out of prison that I've sort of been led down a pathway to discover the Mandela Effect, and it makes a lot of things that I had seen make sense. For example, when I was incarcerated, I saw a Wall Street Journal article, this must have been about 2015, and it showed the distribution of breast cancer cases in the United States. And when I went to medical school, which wasn't that far away from the time the article was written, it was that breast cancer was a disease of principally older women. And the vast majority of cases were at ages 70 plus. Of course, you hear about the unfortunate cases of the 20 or 30-year-old women getting breast cancer, and we have obviously the race for the cure, which they usually do around Mother's Day, and it's important to do all the research and everything. But I would look at that, just that graph they had in the Wall Street, and I'm like, gosh, that's really, really strange how breast cancer changed so much in a relatively short period of time. And, I discussed this with SMQ over the phone, and he says, well, maybe it's an environmental factor. And I'm true, there are environmental factors in play, but the reality is that you have such a large number of older women in our community that are the ones that had in the previous decades, that would be contributing to this older incidence of breast cancer, that they're not getting breast cancer anymore. There's more and more older people, and you should see more and more cases of breast cancer in older individuals, and you're seeing it in younger women. An older woman who is alive or a woman who is alive in the 70s and 80s and carrying the risk of getting older and getting breast cancer, if things had stayed the same, you would still have a lot more breast cancer in the 2010s in older women. You don't. Something changed. I think the issue was that was a Mandela effect with our bodies. Our bodies are changing. These diseases and their distribution are changing. I recently saw something that was posted about the fibula, which is a bone which is located behind the knee. It's sort of opposite the patella, which is in the front of the knee. I've never heard of it. We studied normal anatomy in medical school as well as a ton of abnormal anatomy, and I've seen thousands and thousands of knees. Never heard of fibula. And I was communicating with SMQ on this one. I guess what really brought it home with me is on my iPhone, if I type in patella, it knows it's spelled correctly. That's the front bone of the knee. It's always been there. You type in fibula, and the iPhone doesn't even have a suggestion for it, which makes me think it's probably relatively new discovery. So I think that the Mandela effect is real. I think that most people are unaware of it. I think that the past is very changeable. And another medication that I noticed that came out, there's a medication class called ACE inhibitors. These are medications used to treat blood pressure. Common ones are like drugs like enalapril, which is also called Vasotec, lisinopril, benazepril, quinapril, prenavil. And the thing is, when these medications first came out, they had a problem, something called an ACE cough. Maybe some of the people in the audience have had that. It would cause people to chronically cough. It's a dry, non-productive cough. That number was 25% when these first medications first came out. That means you put 100 patients on them, 25% would have that cough. That number, while I was practicing, I noticed dropped from 25% to about maybe 5%. The medications were simply better tolerated, which makes me, I know the medications didn't change, would have to argue that the people are changing. And it's really weird when you look at something from that perspective, that you expect the past to be stable. You expect your body to be stable. You expect your body's physiology or the way that it functions to be stable. You expect the body's pathology or how it functions in the setting of disease to be stable. And you go to school and you learn that, and it's the truth, at least as you are taught. And I know that SMQ talks a lot about scientism. I was raised in a materialistic universe. Both my parents have PhDs in the hard science. We come from a science family, so that's the background that I bring to the table. And trust me, the past should not be changing. Locations of things should not be changing. Sizes of land masses should not be changing. Things that were once islands and now peninsulas should not be changing. And as I've explained to SMQ, I don't understand why only a small percentage of this, a small percentage of us can in fact see that this is happening in the world in which we live. And so I thought I would just share my perspective as a physician. Yeah, I can actually now even find my own Mandela effects. I don't know if that's something that you can do because you're affected, but I actually found one all by myself. I remember the co-creator of The Simpsons, Sam Simon, dying in 2005, 2006. I remember seeing a story on him in the news and thinking how terrible. You created one of the best, and I'm not a huge Simpsons fan by anything, but you created one of the most successful cartoon or shows, and you've got this great house, and I think it's either Malibu or Pacific Palisades, and how terrible it was to be die or to die of cancer. I mean, you have the whole world going for you, and when you have disease, that doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. If you have a disease, it's kind of a common leveler of all human beings. And so I thought I'd just Google out of curiosity and see when he actually died. And I knew that he had died in my timeline, if you want to use how Chick refers to it. I knew he had died well before I went to federal prison. And so I Googled, and sure enough, he died while I was in federal prison. And I know that those are two different things. And it's very hard to explain that to someone who does not understand the Mandela effect. But nonetheless, I know personally it's true. And so that's basically about all I needed to say. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, I really appreciate what you've shared there. It's phenomenal and amazing, and it really pushes forth our efforts here and what we're trying to do. And this is absolutely something that's very much needed. And this kind of dialogue that we're having right now is absolutely essential for the Mandela Effect community as a whole. I have to ask you, in terms of um, the patients, and when you were under investigation, and when the authorities were talking to you about the way in which you were dispensing the opioids, at that time, did you have any idea that this could be even a particular possibility, or anything like that when that was happening?
As it relates to the Mandela effect being a possibility,
Yes. Even if you
uh,
didn't have a name for it.
no, I didn't understand what was happening. And at the time, everything happened very quickly. And it seemed all very strange to me, the fact that nothing in my practice was really ever hidden. I know all prescriptions I write are traceable. I can maintain records. It seemed like it came kind of out of the blue. And of course, if you anything that you deal with the federal government, they are very, very powerful law enforcement body. And I didn't really have time to process it. I just quickly signed a plea deal with the U.S. Attorney's Office and took care of my affairs and sort of just exited the stage, got put on the sidelines, for lack of a better word. And I guess what really perplexed me the most while I was in prison is that I had essentially no civil litigation falling out from all this purported criminal activity, which I thought was very, very strange, because I had huge malpractice policies and a huge personal umbrella policy. And I'm thinking, gosh, for all these, large number of misprescribed pills, where are all the civil lawsuits? And, we have a 2-year statute of limitation in this state, and they just didn't happen. So I was thinking, that's kind of weird. I mean, but again, when you are in federal prison, you don't have access to the internet. You do have family members that will send you books. You can get books from Amazon. You can get newspapers, so you have some communicate, and you have access to an email system called TrueLinks, where you can connect to the outside world to some degree. Of course, everything, your mail is monitored, your phone calls and email is monitored, which is fine. I mean, I understand that. But I had no way really of processing it all. I felt like I just got kind of clobbered. And now, as I return to the community, I'm kind of picking up the pieces and trying to make sense of everything that happened. Not that I can go back and change it. I've apologized in open court for my role in any activities. I'm moving forward in my life. I'm gainfully employed, doing everything I need to do. But I've always wondered, kind of while I was incarcerated, what happened? How did things get this way? Because I would look in the, we didn't have real mirrors in where I was. It was more of a polished metal surface, obviously for safety reasons and things like that. I kind of look at myself and think, wow, something happened. I really don't belong here. That being said, while I was there, I followed all the rules and, didn't get in any trouble or cause any problems or anything like that. And had a very, productive stay, for lack of a better word. But it was very strange. But speaking of the mirror, that reminded me something that I had last seen a normal mirror before being incarcerated. And then when I got home, and I talked to SMQ about this, is I can see actual changes in my eyes and the reflection that they were never there. And I shave every day, every other day, depending on how motivated I feel. And it's weird, my reflection back in the mirror, what looks back at me, that's, I guess, what we would call a personal Mandela effect. Like the brown of my eye, the pigment containing cells of the iris are all kind of scrunched up. And I can see it, but I don't think my eye doctor can, because I got great insurance with my job. I working now in the heavy equipment industry. And so I took myself to the eye doctor trying to explain with my eyes are all not right when I look at them in the mirror. And, there is a pigment dispersion glaucoma disorder. I don't have that. My eyes are normal to the eye doctor, but they're not normal to me. And so I can tell that something is just off. And I know it wasn't that way before I went away. So, and I know that it had changed when I got home. I don't know what happened in between, because I had no way of knowing. No chance to look in a regular mirror. And now I see it and it's still there. I know something has changed in the world. And maybe that's just my personal reminder of what I've been through, or what we're all going through. I don't know what it all means, but I'm someone who's interested in learning about the Mandela effect. I'm learning about, concepts of, digital consciousness. I read Jim Elvidge's book, which was very good. I'm currently reading My Big Toe, the Tom Campbell complete trilogy. It's a long book, but I'm enjoying reading that and trying to understand better the world in which I thought I lived in isn't the world in which we all live in.
No, I totally understand what you're saying, and I completely sympathize with the situation you're in. And I think the most frightening thing, probably for all of us, is exactly your situation. And I often wonder, because the opium problem now has gotten so massive and so big and so out of control. I'm almost wondering is if the powers that be knew the Mandela effect existed, like we see in all of these FOIA documents. They know a lot about reality that mainstream science doesn't seem to share with the public. And I'm almost wondering if they did these kinds of roundups, of which you are a part of, as a sort of political move in order to show that they're doing something about a problem that is arising from the human body changing itself. Obviously, that's speculation on my part, but it's almost as if you were part of a larger blunting instrument in order to um, sort of misdirect the attention of the public. So when these changes start happening, they already have in place the narrative to say we already have begun, processing doctors and arresting providers and all of that in place. And I'm just wondering if you were, sort of wrapped up in that. But as this continues, and as this goes on, do you see a time, or do you see, let me ask you this, do you think that, do you see an escalation? Now, do you see it in terms of the human body, in terms of what people are reporting? Because I'm seeing inside of like just our chat with just a little over 100 people watching, they're talking about like anything from allergies to, the mesentery system and all kinds of different things that that's personally happening to them. Do you see this as things like that, like the peanut allergy, like autism, all of these things? Do you think that that's part of a broader escalation, that one day they will not be able to pretend like it just isn't happening?
I'm not certain. I've listened, as I told you, I was in about 80 to 85% of your content. And one of the things that I've really taken home from what I've listened to, both you and I listened to the Lost and Found Ben as well, is that there really isn't a future, there's a now. So I don't know where the future is headed, but I have a sense that things can the technology exists such that things can and perhaps will accelerate. In terms of, you talk about roundup of doctors, so on a wing of 40 inmates, we had 6 physicians. That's higher than the percentage of physicians in the general population, I will tell you that. And if you look at the statistics of the Federal Bureau of Prison inmates, they cut across all walks of life. It doesn't matter your ethnicity, your race, your financial background, your educational level. You can have former, co-heads of NASA with people that are, living out in the sticks and making methamphetamine. You see the whole range in that institutional setting. I don't know where this is all going. As I told SMQ AI that I am somewhat concerned that it seems like only a small percentage of us are somewhat marked and that we can see it's actually happening, whereas 98% of the population just goes on business as normal. I would think that I guess the Rock of Gibraltar, something that I know I've talked to SMQ about, that I remember that being an island and it being owned by the British. And I remember it even had a special population of, I guess, mountain goats or sheep that were trapped there and inbred. I saw a special in that. And now it's this strange peninsula where the tip of the peninsula is owned by England, which would be very odd considering that it's attached to the bulk of Spain. It would make sense if there was an island out there that the British still held, but to be holding a piece of a peninsula, it doesn't make any sense, but it doesn't seem as if the general community even cares. Or even, it's like they're just the people that are sort of blinded to the change. They just don't care. And that's what I really worry. You talk about the direction of the future with the things with the body accelerating, or the geo shifts, or strange things in the environment like those neon colored eucalyptus trees. That never happened before. All the purple rabbits or whatever you want to choose. People just accept that as normal, when in fact it really isn't normal. And that's what really scares me. So I don't know what will become of the future. I'm trying to just focus on being the best person I can in the now, understanding the world in which I'm living, trying to do as much good. And this is how I used to be as a physician, trying to do as much good as possible. But I'm trying to understand better the world in which we live. But I don't know about the future. I don't know how much higher authorities are not involved. I don't really have a good sense about that. I'm still in an exploration phase at this time.
No, okay, that's very much, yeah, that's fair what you said about that, and I do appreciate your point of view, and thank you for actually listening. Especially that's a very power of now way of thinking about things, and it's very helpful to get through kind of the day to day things that may come up and cause stress or irritation or whatever. So, in your opinion, um, are you thinking that the population that's not paying attention or the population that doesn't seem to notice, do you think that, and obviously we're all speculating at this point beyond your personal story that happened to you, but do you think that there could be, you oftentimes you hear this concept of downloads, of not getting the downloads, of not getting, do you think it's a matter of, just with what you've observed, it's a matter of us being different, or it is something that we all have inherently, and it's just a matter of the population either being in denial or it's something that they don't want? I mean, just had a gut feeling. What are you thinking about it?
Well, I think that just from a personal standpoint, sometimes it seems easier to me just not to believe that these changes are happening. Like if I had to choose between on the fence, well, is this a change or not? God, it quote feels better, unquote, to just accept things as they are and not think it's a change. So I don't know if that's sort of, to some degree, what like Karl Marx would say, like the opiate of the masses, as he referred to religion, is this thing where people are just content in their own world and content to continue to receive the downloads, content to, in some respects, be passive. I was always taught that if you saw something wrong, that you acknowledged it, and if you could do something to help the situation or do something about it, that you did it. But it seems perhaps that the society is not being guided that way these days, that they're just accepting things. In the case I brought up an example with with SMQ over the phone is this. There was a hiker that disappeared last summer, Sam Sayers, who was a younger woman who was hiking up in the Cascade Mountains and disappeared. And there was some initial press about it. But what really struck me odd about that was, of all the reports I read, nobody bothered to even reference all those missing 411 books by David Polides, which is really strange in that there's a huge volume of literature associated with these people disappearing in national parks. And you would think that some newspaper reporter, journalist, editor would say, hey, why don't you see if that's anything related to that? And you just don't see it. It's like they just expect these things to happen and nobody wants to look any further, which obviously if you're that girl's family or that girl's boyfriend or just a general member of the community, you say, well, that's really, really wrong. That if there's something happening that we should be aware of it, we should talk about it more. But that doesn't seem to be what's reflected in the sort of the general community consensus thinking. And I think the same thing will happen to some degree with the Mandela effect. I mean, some people beyond the level of looking at the pop culture things, with the life is a box, like a box of chocolates, or was like a box of chocolates, most people are going to be content not to look beyond that. And I think that that's maybe setting us up all as human beings, or not all, but the majority, to be just super passive to whatever changes are coming down into the so-called future. I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine, but I think that more people need to be active in the community and remember what happened, because our books change. And it's really bizarre, these changes. Like I remember, I'm the kind of person, I can read hundreds of pages of text and I spot the typos, like when I read novels. And I remember reading a copy of Jurassic Park, one of my favorite books. I like the mathematics in the book. But I read a copy near the end of my prison stay. And I had read that same exact paperback book near the beginning. It's a little bit more beaten up. It's probably read by 100 inmates. I'm like, gosh, that book has so many typos. It didn't have that before. But people will just come to accept that as normal. And I don't see why there should be any typo in a book. I mean, we have spell checkers. I mean, they may have occasional ones put in there to make sure there's not, an issue with plagiarism of a book. People scanning them and reprinting them or putting them in some other digital format. I get that, but I think the vast majority of people simply just don't care. They're distracted doing other things, and they're being kept busy in their own little digital universes, and we're kind of missing the big picture, and that I think is very, very disturbing at a deeper level.
Okay, so that's about the general population, but what about doctors like you that have to? There's bound to be a population of doctors that are out there that have noticed in their own practice, in order to perform a biopsy or something like that properly, they've bound to notice, don't you think?
I'm sure that small percentage is noticed, because as one point that Chicks brought up repeatedly is that the Mandela effect doesn't appear to discriminate. It doesn't matter your ethnicity, your religious background, cultural background. So I'm sure there's a small percentage of physicians that are noted. They probably can't say anything. If you started saying things like this, they would certainly revoke your license and ban you from Medicare and Medicaid. But heck, that's already been done to me, so I can say it. I can't currently practice in the state in which I reside, so I can say it. But they couldn't say it. And I mean, physicians, I think, are pretty resourceful people. They'll figure out something's wrong and they'll adjust. And so, but I don't think that they would ever come out and say it publicly. Right. But I'm sure the numbers are there. As I told you, I'd be interested to see what percentage of the physicians that are incarcerated are Mandela affected. I suspect that's higher, but I don't have any reason to know that. That's only a suspicion, because I didn't know about the Mandela effect while I was serving time with that population to assess that. I didn't have a name or an understanding of what was going on. So unfortunately, I missed the opportunity to get that information. But I imagine there are physicians out there. There are physicians who realize that things have changed, that aren't getting the downloads, and they're probably adjusting. You can adjust. I mean, you can figure out, okay, well, they used to be here, now they're there. I just need to do things a little bit differently. One can do that. It's not that hard. Physicians, on average, are very capable human beings, and most of them are very caring, compassionate, and good at what they do. But I don't think that will be a very vocal community at all, because these people have, lives and practices and mortgages and spouses and kids, and don't want an interruption in their income stream, and don't want to be ostracized saying that, in that small 1 to 2%, that's not a large enough majority really to change consensus thinking, and something is deeply rooted and with as much objective materialism. And even though I don't like SMQ's word, the use of the word scientism, I see that though more and more as I progress, as I go forward in my thinking, as it relates to the Mandela effect, because some of the things that I'm being told by supposed experts aren't necessarily true.
Yeah, and that's that's for lack of a better word or a better phrase, because like I said, we have to first build a language around this, and oftentimes it takes something like this, and someone like you with this kind of authority to come out in order to advance this. So perhaps my hope is, if there are other people in official capacities and it's been affected you, or it has affected you in some way, please come talk to me. You can stay anonymous. I just need some way to figure out that you are who you are, and that's it. And then you will stay completely anonymous. And that is an interesting point that you brought up. And a population I never considered would be engineers or doctors, or folks that have lives of other people in their hands and they're incarcerated. If maybe perhaps they would have a higher instance of the Mandela effect, or being MEs, or even admitting of it, because something had happened that was tragic, and the reason why it did is because, like you said, our bodies have changed, or the mathematics that we're even starting to argue over, that's changed, and just physics and everything basic is changing now. So eventually that's going to come out. I think it can't be stopped. It's like, do you remember a couple of years back when that the plane disappeared? It just
Mm-hmm.
right. A lot of people thought we could have been mid shift, and we had a geo shift happen and the plane simply disappeared. Now, unless you were into the Mandela effect world and into it for years, that would just seem absolutely, completely and utterly absurd. Just absurd. And now that we're this far into this and we're talking, amongst ourselves, and inviting people like you of more authority into this, it doesn't seem that far out. And in fact, I would need a better alternative than it's just gone. It's simply gone, and that's it. Um, I just don't know. And I think it could eventually get to things like, if it's going to change the human body and it affected you in a way, I think eventually it may get to things like, and this is, I wanted to stay away from the scaring of people, because every other YouTube channel does this, but eventually it will go to a car brake. Brake fluid isn't working the way it used to, or something on airplanes aren't working like they used to. That's my fear in the future.
Well, airplanes, SMQ, sure don't look like they used to. And even though I was incarcerated for a number of years because of the nature of my case, I went to the federal, at one of the international airports in this country where they exchange federal prisons. I was there a number of times, and I remember once seeing all those planes with those what are the winglets on the end of the plane.
Mhm.
Almost every plane had one, because when you drive in the in the federal prison bus, you're shackled and you have handcuffs on and leg cuffs on and a belly chain, but you got your eyes, you can look through a window. And I remember looking, and this is again before I knew the Mandela effect. I'm like, I saw the airport, and I'm like, wow, all these planes are different. How did they all get those winglets? They didn't used to have them. I used to get when
Interesting.
I would fly a lot for. I used to oversee a lot of hospices across the country. This is back, a while ago, but I would often fly, and I usually got the seat near the wing because I could look out over the wing and get that emergency exit seat over by the wing because I had a little bit more leg room because I'm a tall guy. And I remember I always looked out across the wing, and there was never I just would imagine what it would be like to be standing on the wing while I was flying, or walking off the edge of the wing, and those winglets, they weren't there. The only plane that had them, And I remember this was a 747 Series 400, had them back in the 90s and 2000s. I remember that because that was the one plane in my mind that always stuck out where you couldn't do that. And when I remember one of the times I went to the Aero, I can't remember if it was 2015 or 2017, seeing all these planes. And I know that those planes are all not new planes because you can't buy that many new planes that quickly. These aircraft in our country have been in service, so I know these planes are changed. And it's bizarre, but it's like almost like I looked at, like it was almost like being in a different world when I saw the aircraft. I'm like, that's really strange. I kind of said that to myself, and kind of kept it to myself. But again, I had no way of that observation that I made in 2015 or 16, or it could have been 14. I went to that federal airlift a number of times. I had no language. I had no knowledge. I had no way of explaining what was my gut understanding that something was very different. It had changed, and I hadn't been locked up that many years that the whole aircraft industry had been changed. I served a relatively short sentence from the span of typical federal prison sentence lengths.
So let me ask you, I know you've been listening to the channel quite a bit, and we talked about that, and you just mentioned it as well. What do you think about those CIA FOIA documents talking about the nature of reality and how existence actually works from the gateway process that the CIA was employing in the 80s?
I think that that's probably correct. And here's what sort of brings it home to me. I watched a lot of that Ancient Aliens series while in prison. They played them all day Fridays, and I didn't have to work in the kitchen on Fridays, and we had it in one of the TV rooms. And what always fascinated me were these amazingly heavy stones, like in in Baalbek, Lebanon, those stones that weigh 1,000 tons, or the stones in Mycenae, Greece, that weigh 70,000 pounds or whatever, 35 tons. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no way we can move those today with all the heavy equipment we have, and there sure was no way they could move them 5,000 years ago. And I was stumped by that, and I can see why the various people on the show are saying, well, those were aliens brought technology. But as I've come to understand the nature of a digital reality in which we live in, if the digital reality insists that there be pyramids present, that's easy just to put the pyramids there. And that's why they're simply there. They're part of the world. All those heavy stones that nobody could move, all suddenly they're there. And that makes sense. And as I talked to you about on the phone, is that when you live in a digital universe and you have the Mandela Effect, it's sort of this concept of Occam's razor. You get an Occam's razor in medicine. If you find the correct diagnosis, it usually explains all the symptoms. That is, you shouldn't be looking for multiple diagnoses, because most of the time in medicine, one diagnosis is only one disease going on. Very rarely is it 2 or 3 at the same time. So when I look at the life as I live in terms of this digital reality, these downloads, and having that, it's sort of like an Occam's razor. It explains a lot of things in one fell swoop. You have an explanation for a great number of things. New species appearing that were never there before in terms of different kinds of whales and those different kinds of bees and all this stuff. All suddenly they show up out of nowhere. Well, you can just insert them into your environment. It's no different than fish living in a fish tank, and all suddenly someone sticks something in the fish tank. Put a castle, one of those little castles in the fish tank. Oh, it just existed. That's in some respect, I think, how we're living, that we get these downloads that they change over time. And I don't know if that's something that comes from God, for example, if that comes from these extra corporeal beings that are talked about in some of the literature. I don't know what's causing it, but I think that it explains an awful lot. Because when you have these downloads, you don't have to follow all the rules of physics. Like, you can able to have a well-positioned, neatly fitting stones that's nothing that anybody could ever lift. Well, suddenly now you can do that in a digital type environment. So I think that that's along the lines. I think those documents that have been released are the beginning of developing our understanding and our language. And I think that as the community, there's a lot more work to be done. And I think that the importance of your channel, SMQ, is you're going beyond the latest discovery of, residue from some, TV program or what have you. I think it's, trying to think about, what does this all mean? What direction are we going as a people? What does it, because I just thought about this morning. If people are fighting over digital reality, whether they're fighting over money or fighting over land or whatever the case, I mean, they're fighting over basically small pieces of information, for lack of a better explanation. That doesn't seem to make as much sense for, it'd be one thing if, I guess, if people were, going to war over land or occupation or natural resources, but it seems like that a lot of that's created digitally, and it's actually subject to change. And I think that perhaps that can be embraced as a good direction if people can recognize that that's actually what's happening and assess the true reality of the world in which we live, and it's not what we think it used to be.
That is very interesting you say that, because I just thought of this idea of what if the Mandela effect is some kind of new form of warfare, and whatever is happening, it ramps it up as kind of you either hold a country or you hold something for ransom, and then you introduce a new Mandela effect as a warning or a or something else. It's interesting. This is why I do these kinds of interviews, because you've got me thinking completely different. Everything is information. You're absolutely correct. Right down to every binary bit of our bodies is information, and just the slightest change, you're right, that's a Mandela effect, and that could be a warning shot over the bow somewhere. And just the countries that we have in existence now, you're ultimately talking about really PR at this point, especially after reading the Gateway Process. Wow, that's really great
Well,
stuff.
I mean, you had a couple of episodes, or maybe it's more than a couple, on World War II. I actually read a fair amount about that in federal prison, and I actually watched I guess, a 12 DVD Ken Burns series on the war. I had time on my hands. A lot of the stuff that you have been discovering about the, balloons and stuff like that, that wasn't there. It's been added after the fact, and it's very, very strange. But again, all I have is, speculation as to what it all means. I'm just recognizing that something is going on. It's kind of like, well, you're in practice of medicine. The first thing you got to do is make a diagnosis before you decide what your plan of treatment is or is not going to be. Is first recognizing the disease process at foot. I feel at this point with the Mandela effect that I'm at the diagnostic stage. I have kind of an idea of what's going on. I have no direction in which to proceed except to be open-minded. And so I do strongly believe that your recruitment of other, authorities, is the word you use, or experts or other people that would be able to provide some additional information and insight to improve the understanding of the community, because I've listened to your chats, and I can see that you're approaching this from the standpoint of not being selfish, not about increasing your numbers, increasing, what little revenue you get, but about actually doing this for the right reason. And I think that that's what's going to prove that's what's going to be proved to be correct over the test of time. I think that's the direction to go.
Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And honestly, I'm coming at this from I need to know. I have to know, and that's the point of the channel. And I've always been interested in this kinds of things, but I must know. I've got to know. This is too big of a thing to not know and to not understand. And the idea that you could take something like computers or computer science or information science, and actually it be a perfect overlay for what they're talking about, in whether it's the gateway process or the psychotronic FOIA documents. It's kind of startling, quite frankly. And it's you can almost see the way in which people, if they knew the Mandela effect or whatever this thing is real, you would almost want people to be distracted. You would almost need them to be stripped down to reductive materialism, because that ensures that you have a captive audience that offers very little, and it asks very few questions. And it takes something like, like you and I, we had our own individual Mandela Effect experiences to wake people up and to make them see that the world truly is absolutely nothing like we thought it was. And that's what makes it all even the more critical for us to do these kinds of expeditions like this. Someone asked, and someone was also talking about the extra glands in the guts. Have you did you know about that one?
Well, the mesentery was always a structure in which the intestines were encased. Basically, it's some connective tissue. Most people, there's a fair amount of adipose tissue in there. There's some blood vessels. I'm not sure whether they're considering it an extra organ or not, or a
Hmm.
new organ. I don't know if that's just a change in semantics or not. Has the mesentery been present? Sure, I've had my hands on it. Obviously wearing gloves and stuff. It's existed, but it wasn't recognized as an organ in itself. And I don't know if that's just a change in words because I figured out it did more than it did. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's certainly always been there. But going back to what you were saying before the question was, I have one simple question for you, SMQ, is recognizing the existence of the Mandela effect, does it change how you conduct yourself in today's world?
Myself, yes, it does.
Mhm.
Very much so. I'll sometimes, someone will. I used to argue people when they said that I would say something, or I would argue with people if I thought they had said something, and I just chalked it up to either their bad memory or mine. I don't argue about that anymore. I don't argue about events because that happened to me, and it's been ramping up for me in particular over the last 8 to 10 years, and I no longer argue those points. Now that's helpful in a lot of ways, but also too, I know that in a lot of ways that it's in my own personal life, it seems to be ramping up personally for me. That's why I was asking you if it's ramping up for me, because I write code all day. I do worry about the breakdown of information systems, because oftentimes the systems that I work with are life and death systems, and I do worry about that. I do worry about the basis of the languages that I speak several computer languages, and I do worry that subtle syntax will change overnight, and immediately we'll have massive life and death processes break down immediately. And I do. I think about that. I wonder about that. And so far, so good. But getting back to like what you were talking about with the World War II, I used to be so much of a swashbuckler in terms of research. If I found something that was intriguing or something that was irresistible, and I had to read and dig and go and go and go, and I did it with a gusto and I did it without fear. And once we started getting into World War II, and it almost looked as if the Mandela effect, or the consciousness of the Mandela effect, was actually using us for um, I don't know, these nefarious Axis power purposes, because it was obvious that, everything that was happening, it was for the benefit of the Axis powers. And it was, for me, it was something that I'm not used to doing. I pulled back, and I asked the team nicely, and everyone decided we just stopped looking, because we were afraid that it was that old concept. Because we were paying attention to it, it was responding, it was reacting differently, because indeed the Axis powers, it was starting to shift and turn, and I was getting anecdotal, but nonetheless, it was enough to shake me up of, different people. Like there was a Canadian troop that was actually storming the beaches in Normandy with the rest of the Axis powers.
Mhm.
Now, this person had told me her grandfather, his story had changed, and he was fighting actually in the Pacific to save Australia. So that means our forces were weaker on D
Right.
Day, and our force, right. And I thought, and how's it, as insane as it sounds, what if by our looking into this, and whatever it is that's clicked out knows we're doing this, has decided to use us as instruments of whatever, of evil, or and I I, I never in a million years would have considered that as rational thinking, but I pulled out and stopped looking, and sure enough, it ended there. I go back, glance every now and then, and Axis powers there's no more bombing, or there isn't increased bombing of California. There isn't
Hmm.
increased bombing of the West Coast. Yes. So, yes, actually, it has changed. I've become more cautious. I've become more, I don't know. Yeah, that's the best way I could put it. So, yes, it has changed my personal behavior and the way that I approach the world. Yes, very much so.
Thank you for sharing that. I do appreciate your personal perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a very real thing to me. Obviously, it's a very real thing to you. And everyone that comes back week after week, I know it's real for them as well. And that's why I really enjoy this tight knit community that we've created here over this time, and we're able to attract people like yourself, people in positions of authority, people who understand things that we don't understand, and you're able to give an account that has authority to it. So I keep these to an hour, and that's one of
Okay.
the beauties about this. And I'm going to start to wrap this up, but I want you to, if there's anything else that you wanted to get out there, and I certainly would love to have you back on if you'd like to come back on if you feel comfortable. If not, I don't want to pressure you in any way. But if there's anything you'd like to wrap up with or anything you wanted to get out there, please do now.
Now, I will be happy to reappear in the future. I want to continue to grow with this community. And to anyone who's listening out there who would like to come forward, I can tell you that my anonymity has been protected and preserved, and I do appreciate that. And SMQAI has been true to his word on that. So if you were feeling like you might want to say something, I feel very comfortable that I'm, in a protected position. I want to grow with the community, and I'd be happy to appear again at some point in the future. I think it's in the benefit of, yes, it does help me personally to explain what's going on, but I think the real benefit is to the community as a whole. So I want to thank you for allowing me to be on the show.
Well, and I appreciate that, and I think that's a wonderful way to close out the show. I also want to thank for the super chats. I want to thank Ziggy Wolf, and I want to thank Michelle's opinions. Thank you so much. Yeah, the white sun isn't right. Oh, before we go, what do you think about that? By the way, that's a great question. It bothers me. It just bugs me to no end. I see a white sun, and I remember a. I grew up at the ocean front at the beach on the East Coast. I remember a yellow sun just beating down on my skin, and I used to love it. What has the sun changed for you, by the way?
It used to be yellow, now it's white. But you know what? I'm okay with it.
Me too.
And that's okay I think when you realize, you come to understand what's going on, you find out that there is a supportive community out there. And I think as we, grow the community, and I'm certainly happy to do my small part in that. And I appreciate the efforts of the people that are really turning eventually to become the leaders in the community. It does provide some solace that it's okay, and not something to have emotional stress over, not something to raise your blood pressure, not someone to get in an argument with a loved one about. That's just part of the world. It's more than the simple materialism we were all taught in school.
Oh, that's well said. I think that's a wonderful way to end this conversation. And Doc, thank you so much for agreeing to this. Thank you so much for talking with me all these other times. And I'm already looking forward to our next conversation on the channel. To everyone else, if I don't talk to you before Saturday, I certainly will see you then. I'm always on Twitter. I try to reach out as soon as I can. I don't keep my notifications on Twitter or YouTube or anywhere else, but I do try to look at least a couple times a day for everyone else. To the doctor, thank you again. And to everyone else, we'll see you Saturday, if not sooner. Thank you very much.